Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the sands of the ancient Roman arena, where the clashing of swords and the roar of the crowd are all that stands between a gladiator and their fate. Imagine the adrenaline, the sweat, the tension before each fight. It's a brutal world, but it's also a world where fame and fortune can come with a single victorious swing of the sword. You probably won't survive this, just kidding. But seriously, it's no easy life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and feel free to share where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The life of a Roman gladiator was, without a doubt, one of extremes. Violence on the one hand, and the possibility of unimaginable glory and wealth on the other. It's easy to imagine them as mere slaves, thrust into the arena to fight to the death, but the truth was often more complicated. Gladiators came from a variety of backgrounds. Some were slaves, others were criminals, and some were even volunteers who chose the life of a fighter for the chance at fame, fortune, or simply to pay off a debt. These volunteers were known as octorati, and while they weren't coerced into fighting, they sure didn't do it for free. When a man decided to step into the arena, he was fully aware of the risks but also of the rewards. Victorious gladiators, who often became celebrities in their own right, could earn a pretty penny, and the chance for fame was like nothing else in the ancient world. You see, gladiatorial combat wasn't just about bloodshed, it was also about entertainment. The games, which took place in the grand amphitheaters like the Colosseum, were a way to keep the masses entertained, distracted, and loyal to the emperor. Winning in the arena could mean adulation from the crowds, and a real shot at social mobility, even if you were a lowly slave at first. However, that fame came at a steep price. For many gladiators, the path to fortune and fame was littered with the corpses of those who didn't make it out alive. The combat was harsh, often ending with life-or-death struggles. Historians still argue about how frequently gladiators were killed in the arena. Some scholars believe that gladiators were trained with such precision and discipline that they rarely died, while others suggest the brutality was much more unforgiving. What we know for sure is that every fight was a dangerous gamble, and each gladiator had to balance the fine line between survival and showmanship. Life in the training schools, known as ludi, was no less grueling. Gladiators spent years perfecting their craft under the watchful eye of their doctors, the trainers who pushed them to their limits. This training was all about discipline. No matter how much pain, no matter how many wounds, the gladiator had to keep pushing forward. But it wasn't just about the sword. Gladiators also had to master tactics, learn to entertain the crowds, and sometimes even perform stunts to enhance the spectacle of their fights. The more exciting the performance, the more popular they became, which could mean bigger rewards. But beyond the brutal physical demands, there was a strange relationship between the gladiators and the crowd. The spectators who came in droves to witness the games weren't just there for bloodlust. They were there to cheer, to be thrilled, to witness something that could be both deeply violent and profoundly moving. Gladiators who captured the crowd's heart were often treated like rock stars, given gifts, money, and sometimes even the freedom to walk away from the arena. Historians still argue about how much freedom gladiators actually had. Some claim that they could be freed after a number of successful wins, while others say it was little more than a rumor. What's undeniable is that the gladiators had an intimate, symbiotic relationship with their audience. The better they fought, the more attention they received. But with this fame came the possibility of a brutal end, either in battle or by the whims of the emperor. A gladiator's life was constantly teetering between the heights of fame and the depths of mortality. It was a hard life, yes, but also one that held the tantalizing allure of immortality through the roar of the crowd. There were no guarantees in this world, though. Some gladiators lived long enough to retire with their fortune, while others were less lucky. What we often don't hear about is how many gladiators quietly slipped into obscurity, forgotten once their brief moment of fame ended. Fame in ancient Rome wasn't easy to hold on to, and even the greatest of gladiators could be relegated to history's shadows after their final fight. Still, it didn't stop them from dreaming of that one final victory. It didn't stop them from hoping they could end their career with a gift from the emperor, or even a statue in their honor. So, what was it like to live as a gladiator in ancient Rome? To walk that line between fame and death, to fight for glory, but knowing that glory was often as fleeting as the time it took to draw a sword? It was a brutal, intense, and at times thrilling existence. an existence that demanded sacrifice, strength, and above all, the will to survive. But even in the face of all that danger, there was the possibility of something rare and beautiful in this blood-soaked world. A moment when the gladiator became more than just a fighter. They became a legend. As we dive deeper into the life of a gladiator, we find that it wasn't just about swinging a sword and waiting for the crowds to cheer. Gladiators were multi-talented individuals, with skills far beyond what we typically imagine when we think of battle-hardened warriors. Their abilities were honed not only for fighting but for engaging with the audience, demonstrating strength and agility in ways that would leave modern athletes in awe. At the core of a gladiator's training was combat, of course, but many were also trained in public speaking and theatrics. Imagine a gladiator walking into the arena, not just as a fighter, but as a performer, one who could use his words and gestures to stoke the crowd's excitement. Gladiators often engaged in chants or shouted words to rile up the masses before and after their fights. This wasn't just an opportunity to show off their charisma, it was also a way to manipulate the crowd's emotions. Historians still argue whether gladiators consciously performed to sway the crowd or whether it was a natural extension of their training to be seen as both a skilled fighter and an entertainer. Some scholars suggest that gladiators received specific training in rhetoric, enabling them to command attention before the blood was even spilled. But the art of the fight was, of course, the centerpiece of their skill set. Gladiators were taught various fighting styles, each suited to different types of opponents and combat situations. These styles ranged from the heavily armored Mirmillo, who wielded a large shield and sword, to the more nimble Retiarius, who fought with a net and trident. Some gladiators, like the Secutor, were specifically trained to fight against the Retiarius, making the battles a complex game of strategy. The styles weren't just arbitrary, they were designed to showcase the gladiators' diverse skill sets and create dramatic, visually exciting contests. It's almost like ancient Rome's version of WWE, only with real weapons. And yet, there was so much more to being a gladiator than just fighting. Some gladiators were trained in acrobatics. Yes, you read that right, acrobatics. These gladiators could flip and twist mid-air, using their agility to gain the upper hand over their opponents, and sometimes even entertaining the crowd with breathtaking stunts. These skills weren't just impressive in battle, they were a way of enhancing the overall spectacle of the games. A gladiator's acrobatics could become the highlight of a fight, adding an element of surprise and drama that kept the audience on the edge of their seats. Then there were the animal trainers. Gladiators weren't always pitted against other humans. Some were tasked with battling wild animals in the arena: lions, tigers, bears, even elephants. In these cases, gladiators would need to learn how to subdue and control wild creatures, a skill that required immense patience, bravery, and a deep understanding of animal behavior. These gladiators were not just fighters, they were also masters of managing dangerous beasts, making them crucial to the grand spectacles of ancient Rome. Historians still argue whether these animal fights were more for the gladiators' benefit or the crowd's enjoyment. Some suggest that the gladiators' interaction with the animals was seen as a way to demonstrate their mastery over the natural world, an embodiment of Roman power. Others claim the fights were primarily for show, with gladiators often fighting animals that were already weak, sick, or starved to ensure the gladiators' survival. But in either case, these animal battles were some of the most thrilling and dangerous parts of the games, adding another layer to the gladiators' multifaceted roles. The idea that gladiators were purely fighters is a misconception. They were craftsmen of their craft, skilled in a range of talents, and could entertain in ways that modern athletes would envy. Whether it was through their combat skills, acrobatics, or command of the crowd, gladiators weren't just warriors, they were multi-talented performers, drawing from a repertoire of skills to ensure their survival and rise to fame in the ancient world. But despite all this talent, there was one thing that constantly hung over the gladiators' heads: the ever-present possibility of death. Every fight was a gamble, and even the most skilled gladiator couldn't be certain of surviving the arena. While gladiators could rise to fame and fortune, their lives were ultimately controlled by the whims of the emperor, the crowd, and the arena itself. Their fame could be fleeting as quickly as it had been earned, and the next fight could be their last. But the fact remains that the most skilled gladiators were often treated like royalty. Some even had dedicated fans who would follow their careers religiously. Some gladiators, who were able to survive the intense rigors of combat, even reached the point where they could buy their freedom. In some cases, a successful gladiator might be granted a wooden sword, called a rudis, which symbolized his freedom. But the price of that freedom was steep, and the process of achieving it was as grueling as the fight itself. Historians still debate whether these freedom-granting opportunities were common or rare, with some arguing that many gladiators simply never lived long enough to reach this point. However, for those who did manage to gain their freedom, the rewards were immense. So, the gladiators weren't just muscle-bound killers, they were performers, acrobats, and sometimes even animal handlers. Their skill set went beyond the blade, stretching into areas of entertainment and public engagement that we might not typically associate with ancient warriors. It's clear that the life of a gladiator was complex, and the line between slave and celebrity was often thinner than we imagine. But even with all their talents, their ultimate fate was still out of their hands. Whether they lived or died depended as much on the crowd's fickle mood as it did on their own fighting skills. As we take a closer look at the gladiator's life, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The path to becoming a master of combat wasn't just about brute strength or skill in the arena. The gladiator's body was a finely tuned instrument, carefully maintained through diet and nutrition. While modern athletes might spend hours in gyms and on specialized regimens, ancient gladiators had their own ways of keeping their bodies in peak condition, ensuring they could fight, perform, and survive. To understand the diet of a gladiator, it's important to first recognize that they weren't eating what the average Roman did. Roman society was divided by wealth, and the common Roman's diet might consist of bread, vegetables, and limited amounts of meat. But gladiators who trained relentlessly for combat needed a diet designed to fuel their intense physical exertion and maintain the kind of muscle mass and strength that could keep them alive in the arena. It wasn't just about eating for survival, gladiators ate to perform. Historians still argue whether gladiators' diets were as strict as we imagine. Some researchers believe they were fed an incredibly high-protein diet, full of meat and eggs, while others suggest that the gladiators' diet was more vegetable-based, focusing on legumes and barley, which were cheaper and easier to come by. What's clear, though, is that gladiators were often given pulse, a type of porridge made from barley, wheat, or oats. This was a staple food because it provided long-lasting energy, perfect for long hours of training and intense physical activity. But it wasn't just the food that kept gladiators fueled, it was also their careful regimen of drinks and supplements. Gladiators were known to consume a special drink made from ashes, often referred to as gladiator's potion, which was high in calcium. This was said to help strengthen their bones and prevent injury, which was critical in a world where fractures and breaks were common. In fact, some archaeologists have found evidence that gladiators were referred to as horderii, a term that loosely translates to barley men, referencing their high intake of grains that were considered to be more filling and less expensive than other food options. While we picture gladiators as muscular giants, their bodies were not just about muscle mass but also about maintaining stamina and resilience. Gladiators spent hours training, and their body type was lean and wiry, built for endurance as much as strength. They were trained to fight with skill and precision rather than brute force alone. This is why their diet was so carefully tailored to their physical needs. Interestingly, gladiators didn't just train their bodies, they trained their minds as well. Their combat training was designed not only to make them capable of surviving the arena but to enable them to outwit their opponents. The more strategic a gladiator was, the more likely they were to succeed. But a strategic mind needed nourishment just as much as a strong body. The diet, with its combination of grains and protein, helped maintain the focus needed for high-level combat. The food also played a role in a gladiator's recovery process. After an exhausting training session or a brutal fight in the arena, gladiators needed to heal quickly, and the right nutrients helped them do that. The grains provided carbohydrates that could restore energy, while the proteins helped repair muscle tissue. In a world where wounds and injuries were common, proper nutrition was essential to getting back into the fight quickly. Beyond what they ate, the act of eating itself had significance. The ludi, gladiator training schools, were strict environments, and meals were often communal, reinforcing a sense of solidarity among gladiators. They ate together, often in shared quarters, with each meal reinforcing their shared experience as fighters. And while the gladiators may not have had the luxury of choosing their meals, they had an undeniable bond forged by the shared struggles of survival. They were in it together, from the shared pain of their training to the moments of glory in the arena. There was, however, one major misconception about gladiators' diets. Modern portrayals often emphasize the idea that gladiators were simply meat eaters, but in reality, they may have consumed more vegetables than people typically think. The gladiators' diet may not have been the blood-soaked feast of steaks and chops we imagine, but rather one of simple, hearty, and functional food designed to keep them strong and healthy. Some sources suggest that gladiators were even given a type of vegetable stew, providing them with the necessary vitamins and minerals to counter the physical stresses of their brutal existence. On top of that, the food was more than just sustenance. It was part of a larger system that reinforced the gladiators' position within Roman society. The food they ate, combined with the brutal training regimen, was a constant reminder of their place in the world. The better their diet, the better their chances of surviving. The gladiators had to prove their worth, not just in combat but in maintaining the physical and mental health required to thrive in their world. While their food and drink might seem simple or even monotonous to us, it was precisely what they needed to perform at their best. The gladiators' diet wasn't a matter of luxury, it was survival. In the unforgiving world of the arena, where each day could be their last, everything, down to the last bite, had to serve the goal of making it through the fight. The gladiators of ancient Rome weren't just hardened warriors. They were finely tuned athletes, constantly honing their bodies to be the best they could be in the arena. And while their diet was far from glamorous, it gave them the strength and endurance to face the endless challenges that awaited them in the brutal spectacle of Roman combat. Let's move on to the fascinating world of the gladiators' wardrobe, an essential part of their identity in the arena. While we tend to think of gladiators as men in loincloths, wielding swords and shields, the truth is that their gear was much more elaborate and varied. The gladiators' armor was more than just protection. It was a symbol of their role in Roman society, a statement about their combat style, and in many cases, a way to intimidate their opponents and impress the audience. The armor a gladiator wore was specifically designed to reflect his fighting style, and there were different types depending on the type of fighter he was. Each style came with its own distinct armor, making it easy for the crowd to identify who was fighting and what kind of combat they could expect. Gladiators were categorized by their weapons and armor, and each category had its own name: Myrmillo, Retiarius, Secutor, Thracian, and so on. Take for example the Myrmillo. This gladiator, one of the most iconic, wore a large rectangular shield called a scutum and a gladius, a short sword ideal for thrusting. His helmet was heavy, with a prominent crest on top that gave him an imposing look. The helmet itself was often designed to look like a fish, perhaps to symbolize strength or ferocity. In contrast, the Retiarius had far less armor. Instead of a helmet, the Retiarius wore a simple headband, and his primary weapons were a net and trident, which he used to ensnare and attack his opponent from a distance. He wore little more than a loincloth and arm guards, making him vulnerable but incredibly agile. This disparity in armor reflected their differing combat techniques. The Myrmillo was a heavily armored, close-quarters fighter, while the Retiarius relied on speed and finesse. Then there was the Secutor, often paired against the Retiarius in the arena, whose armor was designed to counter the lighter gear of the Retiarius. The Secutor wore a helmet with a smooth, rounded design to prevent his opponent from entangling his head with a net. His armor was more complete, with a full-body protection setup that made him a formidable and relatively slow opponent. The crowd loved these matchups because of the striking contrast between the two gladiator styles. The armor was not just about function but also about spectacle. The intricacy of the armor often made it a symbol of the gladiator's skill and status. Gladiators who became famous could even have custom-made gear, often with additional decorations and modifications that made them stand out in the arena. Historians still argue whether this custom armor was always a sign of status or simply a reflection of the gladiators' wealth. Whether the rich gladiators had a better chance at survival because they could afford more advanced armor. There are even records that suggest some of the wealthier gladiators might have fought with extra layers of armor, increasing their chance of survival but reducing the spectacle. After all, the crowds were there for a show, and the more dramatic the fight, the better. Another important aspect of the gladiators' armor was the gladiators' greaves or acria, which were shin guards worn to protect the lower legs during combat. These were crucial because much of the action in the arena took place at the ground level, and legs were often the target for strikes. The acria were made from materials like bronze or leather, providing both protection and mobility. The gladiator needed to be agile enough to dodge and strike quickly, and these greaves allowed him to do so without compromising his movement. But beyond the battle-ready armor, gladiators sometimes had to make a statement with their appearance. The gladiator's crest, often worn on the helmet, was a key element that allowed spectators to distinguish one fighter from another. Gladiators might have been seen as commodities by their owners, but they were also performers, and their appearance was part of the show. These crests could be elaborate, sometimes sporting feathers or even animal pelts, making the gladiators look larger than life. It wasn't just about protection, it was about crafting an identity that both the gladiators and the crowd could get behind. And some gladiators, especially those who were especially beloved, could even wear luxurious clothing when they weren't in the arena, enhancing their celebrity status. The use of armor wasn't limited to just protection. It also had a symbolic value. A gladiator's armor was meant to show his role in the social hierarchy of Rome. A high-ranking gladiator, or one who had won many battles, might wear a more decorated and expensive suit of armor, signaling his elevated status in the gladiatorial world. However, no matter how finely decorated, a gladiator's armor could never fully shield him from the ultimate danger of the arena, death. But the armor was only part of the gladiator's relationship with the arena. Some gladiators, especially the most skilled, might even develop a sense of identity through their armor. Their gear became a way to represent their persona, an extension of themselves. For a gladiator, the armor was like a second skin, something that defined who they were in the eyes of the crowd. The way they wore it, the way they moved in it, and even the way they cared for it all contributed to the gladiator's image. In fact, the gladiator's identity and status were often wrapped up in the way their armor was presented in the arena. It wasn't just a uniform, it was a tool that spoke volumes about who they were. The Murmillo's heavy protective gear said, "I am a soldier, a defender." The Retiarius' minimal armor and quick movements said, "I am a hunter, elusive and unpredictable." In the end, the gladiator's armor wasn't just a means of defense. It was an extension of his fighting style, his persona, and his relationship with both his opponent and the crowd. The intricate design of the armor, combined with its functionality, was part of what made the gladiator's world so fascinating. The gear wasn't just for survival, it was for show, for status, and for spectacle. In a way, the gladiator's wardrobe reflected the Roman Empire itself. Grand, strategic, and focused on making a lasting impression. Now that we've seen how gladiators prepared their bodies and adorned themselves in the arena, let's dive into the intense and rigorous training that transformed ordinary men into these legendary fighters. The gladiator training schools, known as ludi, were no places of ease. These were brutal environments where physical endurance, mental toughness, and tactical brilliance were forged. The training was designed to create warriors capable of withstanding the most demanding battles in the arena, and it wasn't just about swinging swords. Gladiators were molded into living weapons, their bodies shaped through a variety of exercises and strict discipline. First, we should note that gladiator training was far from a casual affair. It took years to become a skilled fighter, and the journey was punishing. When recruits, most of whom were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, first arrived at the ludi, they were generally weak and unskilled. But by the time they had undergone the full training regimen, they were lean, muscular, and agile. Their training often started with basic fitness and conditioning, building up strength, flexibility, and stamina. This initial phase might involve exercises such as running, jumping, and lifting heavy weights. But it was the specialized combat training that truly set gladiators apart. Historians still argue about the exact details of the training, but one thing is clear: it was grueling. Gladiators were taught to fight with a variety of weapons, from swords to tridents, from shields to nets. Each type of gladiator had his own unique set of skills, which were sharpened through endless repetition. The Murmillo practiced with his gladius and shield, learning how to move with agility despite the weight of his armor. The Retiarius, on the other hand, practiced the delicate art of using his net to entangle his opponent, followed by quick strikes with his trident. The Secutor perfected the art of chasing and cornering his opponent, using his heavy armor to withstand the netting of a Retiarius while also staying nimble enough to strike. But it wasn't just about being good with a weapon, it was about endurance. Gladiators spent long hours under the watchful eye of their doctors or trainers, who were often ex-gladiators themselves. These trainers knew firsthand the demands of the arena and pushed their students to their limits. The drills were designed not only to strengthen the body but to develop the mental fortitude needed to survive. The gladiators learned how to fight with exhaustion, how to continue battling even when they were hurt or on the verge of collapse. They were taught to stay sharp and to think quickly in the heat of battle, relying on muscle memory and instinct to make decisions in split seconds. One of the most important aspects of training was developing musculature. Gladiators were famed for their physique, and their rigorous daily routines made them some of the most physically fit individuals in the Roman Empire. Their training was designed to build strength while maintaining flexibility. This was key in ensuring they could move quickly and deliver powerful strikes. They were trained to be quick on their feet, but also strong enough to absorb blows and keep fighting. There was little room for weakness in a gladiator's body. Each flaw or vulnerability could be the difference between life and death in the arena. In addition to physical training, gladiators were also instructed in strategy and tactics. Gladiator combat was as much about the mind as it was about the body. Ludi didn't just teach fighters to fight, they taught them how to outthink their opponents. The gladiators learned to anticipate their enemies' moves, to feint and misdirect, to use the environment of the arena to their advantage. They were often paired up with others to practice specific techniques, and these sparring sessions were essential to developing their skills. The ability to read and react to an opponent's movements was crucial, knowing when to attack, when to defend, and when to wait for the right opportunity to strike. The idea of combat being an art form rather than just physical strength was essential to gladiator training. For many gladiators, the prospect of becoming a star in the arena meant having to perform for the crowd. They had to balance brutal efficiency with theatricality. Sometimes it wasn't enough to simply defeat your opponent. You had to do so in a way that thrilled the audience. This meant that a gladiator's performance could be just as important as the actual outcome of the fight. Some gladiators even practiced acrobatics and other performances, learning how to twirl and display their agility while keeping their opponents on their toes. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that training wasn't just about the fight itself. Gladiators were often trained in ways to survive even if they didn't win. While the image of the gladiator dying in the arena is often romanticized, the reality is that the vast majority of gladiators didn't die in their fights. Roman combatants were prized for their ability to entertain, and losing a valuable gladiator to death was bad for business. Instead, most battles ended in a way that left both fighters alive, though often wounded. If a gladiator did fall, it was usually at the discretion of the emperor or the crowd, who would call for mercy or death with their thumbs, either pollice verso or a gesture that meant spare or kill. Still, despite the risks of death, most gladiators fought repeatedly in their careers, often enduring dozens of battles. To keep them in fighting shape, their trainers focused on making them not only strong but also resilient. Mental conditioning was as important as physical strength. Gladiators were taught to embrace the reality of pain and to work through it. Fear, pain, and exhaustion were constant companions in their training, and many gladiators learned to block them out, focusing only on the fight ahead. However, the life of a gladiator wasn't solely about battle. They also had to learn how to endure in a world of politics and shifting power. Gladiators were often manipulated by their owners and the emperor's administration. They were aware that a single bad performance could mean the end of their career and sometimes their lives. This made their training all the more intense. They had to be ready for anything. Gladiator training was, in essence, a crucible. It took ordinary men and transformed them into living legends, skilled not only in combat but in performance. Their discipline, their focus, and their physical prowess were all honed to perfection. The Ludi were more than just training grounds, they were the forges where gladiators were shaped, where they learned not only to fight but to survive, to entertain, and sometimes to become immortal. Now that we've explored the brutal training and the physical toll gladiators faced, let's take a detour and explore a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of gladiatorial combat: the role of women in the arena. Yes, women gladiators, though they were rare, they did exist, and their involvement in the games adds another layer to the already complex and captivating world of gladiatorial combat. When we think of gladiators, we usually picture muscular men, heavily armed, facing off in brutal one-on-one combat. Women, however, didn't initially have a place in the public perception of the games. After all, the Roman Empire was a patriarchal society, and women were generally excluded from military and violent affairs. However, history reveals that some women, often referred to as gladiatrices, did indeed participate in these deadly spectacles. The idea of female gladiators challenges many assumptions about the role of women in ancient Roman society. While it was unusual for women to fight as gladiators, The fact that they did so is well documented in ancient texts and visual art. These women weren't mere novelties or oddities, they were fierce competitors who fought alongside men in the arenas, and in some cases they even became quite famous. Their participation, while rare, sheds light on the fascinating and often paradoxical nature of Roman entertainment. Historians still argue whether female gladiators were a common occurrence or an oddity reserved for specific, perhaps politically motivated occasions. Some scholars suggest that women participated in the games during special events or as a form of spectacle designed to attract attention, perhaps to show off the exotic nature of women fighting in the arena. Others believe that female gladiators could have been more prevalent than we think, particularly during the reign of Emperor Domitian, who reportedly staged events featuring women gladiators for the amusement of the public. One of the most famous references to female gladiators comes from a series of inscriptions and statues that depict women participating in gladiatorial combat. One notable example is an inscription from the Roman province of Germania, which mentions a female gladiator named Amazon, who fought in the arena. This was a time when such spectacles were meant to awe and entertain, so it's possible that gladiatrices were seen as a novelty, a rare but compelling addition to the regular male-dominated fights. Yet these women still had to undergo the same rigorous training and perform with the same skill and endurance as their male counterparts. What might surprise you is that the gladiatorial games, at least in their early form, were sometimes associated with religious ceremonies. Some scholars believe that female gladiators may have been included in certain religious festivals dedicated to gods of war or fertility, where their participation was meant to symbolize the power of both masculine and feminine forces in the empire. The presence of female gladiators could have been seen as a way of balancing the brutality and masculinity of the traditional male combatants with a touch of something more exotic or unconventional. The women who fought in the arena were not only brave, they had to be skilled in a variety of combat styles, just like their male counterparts. While there is less evidence about the specific combat styles used by female gladiators, it's likely that they trained in similar ways, mastering weapons like swords, shields, and tridents. In many ways, their training would have been identical to that of the men. They would have needed to learn how to wield these weapons with precision and how to survive the physical and mental stress of gladiatorial combat. The skills involved went beyond just physical prowess. There was a great deal of strategy, timing, and showmanship required to be successful in the arena. But it wasn't just about the physicality of the fight, it was about how these women navigated their role in society. Being a female gladiator in Rome was not an easy path, and often, it meant stepping outside the traditional roles that women were expected to occupy. Roman women were generally not encouraged to take part in violent or public affairs, so these women were defying societal norms just by participating. But much like their male counterparts, some women found fame and fortune through their victories in the arena, gaining a level of recognition that they wouldn't have achieved in other areas of society. Interestingly, some sources suggest that female gladiators were treated somewhat differently from men. Some accounts claim that women were sometimes given special treatment or privileges after their victories. While men were often sent back to their owners or trainers after a loss, victorious female gladiators could receive fame and riches that might be uncommon for men. There are even stories of female gladiators receiving gifts, the admiration of the crowds, and even freedom. Still, while their victories could lead to rewards, the risk of death in the arena was the same for them as for men, and some women were also forced to fight to the death in the most brutal of spectacles. Roman writers did not always view female gladiators in the same way they viewed their male counterparts. While male gladiators were often seen as brave warriors, there was a sense of novelty and curiosity surrounding female gladiators. Some contemporary Roman writers even found their participation in the games to be shocking or scandalous. In fact, the historian Suetonius, in his writings about Emperor Domitian, notes that the emperor staged fights between women as a form of exotic entertainment. He refers to the women gladiators as stuprum or disgrace, reflecting the uncomfortable tension between Roman society's views on women's roles and the spectacle of female violence. Though female gladiators were an anomaly in the larger history of gladiatorial combat, their existence adds complexity to our understanding of Roman entertainment and gender roles. They represent the tension between the restrictive norms of Roman society and the bloodthirsty spectacles that people flocked to. They were symbols of rebellion in an empire where even the strongest women were generally relegated to more private, domestic spheres. Female gladiators, therefore, weren't just fighters. They were powerful statements about what could happen when boundaries were pushed and when society's expectations were defied. While their appearances in the arena may have been rare, the stories of female gladiators remind us that the world of gladiatorial combat was far more complicated and diverse than we often give it credit for. These women weren't just fighting for the entertainment of the crowds, they were fighting for their place in a world that, for all its bloodshed and violence, had no clear place for them. Now that we've explored the fascinating and rare presence of women gladiators, let's move into a more institutional realm of the gladiatorial games, namely the role of the emperor in shaping these blood-soaked spectacles. The gladiatorial games were not only about entertainment but also about power, control, and propaganda. For emperors, the arena was a stage, a place where they could demonstrate their power, assert dominance over the populace, and engage in political theater. Gladiators, therefore, were more than just fighters. They were tools in the emperor's larger strategy of maintaining control over the Roman people. The emperor's involvement in gladiatorial games was not just about approving or organizing the events. It was about using them as a means to display generosity, reinforce loyalty, and even demonstrate divine favor. The games were one of the primary ways an emperor could interact directly with the people of Rome, earning their support through grand spectacles. It was a political maneuver designed to curry favor, distract the population from unrest, and solidify the emperor's image as a provider and protector. Historians still argue whether the gladiatorial games were originally meant to be solely about entertainment or whether they began as more of a religious or ceremonial ritual before evolving into the spectacles we know today. Some scholars believe that gladiatorial contests initially started as religious sacrifices to the gods, particularly during funerals of high-ranking officials. However, as time went on, the emperors took control of the games, shaping them into public displays of power. The emperor's sponsorship of these games became crucial to his reign. When an emperor sponsored a ludi, a series of games, it was a display of his ability to provide for the people and maintain peace and order through entertainment. It was essentially a form of social currency that ensured loyalty from both the lower classes and the elite. One emperor who famously used gladiatorial games as a tool for political gain was Emperor Augustus. Augustus is credited with formalizing the gladiatorial games, though his reign saw a shift in the nature of these events. While the games began as a part of religious rituals, Augustus recognized their potential to increase his popularity with the masses. By hosting extravagant games, he could distract the Roman people from political problems, military defeats, or economic struggles. Historians still argue whether Augustus's motives were entirely political or if he genuinely enjoyed the games, but it's clear that he understood their value as a tool of statecraft. By providing these games, he maintained the loyalty of the people and symbolized his ability to bring stability and prosperity to Rome. Later emperors, particularly during the Flavian dynasty, took the use of gladiatorial games to new heights. Emperor Vespasian, for example, saw the construction of the Colosseum, the most iconic symbol of Roman gladiatorial games, as a method of cementing his legitimacy after the chaos of the civil wars. Vespasian knew that an emperor who could provide such grand spectacles would be loved by the masses, and he used the Colosseum as a central venue for his ludi to reinforce his power. His son, Emperor Titus, expanded on this legacy. The opening games of the Colosseum, which were held in 80 AD, are said to have lasted for 100 days, with thousands of gladiators and wild animals. Titus used these games to mark his imperial victory and to remind the public of his supremacy. But it wasn't just about showcasing power. The gladiatorial games also served as a way for emperors to communicate their virtues and divine favor. A successful emperor, in the eyes of the Roman people, was one who could demonstrate favor from the gods, and the games were seen as an opportunity to reinforce this. Victory in the arena was often portrayed as a sign of divine favor, and the emperor who sponsored the games was seen as having the gods on his side. During these games, emperors could present themselves as protectors of Rome, using the gladiators to display their own invincibility and strength. There's a fascinating debate among scholars as to whether the emperor truly controlled the outcome of the games, or whether the outcomes were largely dictated by the skill of the gladiators themselves. Some believe that emperors had a hand in deciding who would live or die based on political considerations. If a gladiator became too popular, for example, there might be pressure for the emperor to order his execution, fearing that the gladiator could gain too much power or influence. Others argue that the games were largely governed by tradition and the crowd's reaction, with the emperor sometimes ceding control to the popular will of the people. After all, the emperor's power was inextricably linked to public opinion. If the crowd's bloodlust was satisfied, the emperor could bask in their approval. However, the political importance of the games didn't end with the gladiators themselves. Emperors also used the games as an opportunity to highlight their military achievements and demonstrate their control over the empire. Often, a victory in the arena would be paired with grand displays of military triumph. The emperor might host games that commemorated a recent conquest, using the gladiators as symbols of Roman military might. In these cases, the gladiators would fight in mock reenactments of battles, acting out the victories of the emperor's army. In some instances, gladiators even fought in staged naval battles or naumachii, where large bodies of water were artificially created in the arena. These grand spectacles not only entertained the crowds but also underscored the emperor's power, positioning him as the supreme leader of an empire that could conquer lands and stage the most incredible events for the enjoyment of the people. The ultimate goal of the games, from the emperor's perspective, was to keep the Roman populace engaged, distracted, and loyal. The gladiatorial spectacles served as a reminder that the emperor was in control. He was the one who could provide entertainment, manage the empire's military might, and even grant mercy to the vanquished. The crowd's roar, the thrill of bloodshed, and the visible presence of the emperor in the arena all worked together to reinforce the idea that the emperor was not just a ruler, but a protector of Roman order and tradition. By the time we reach the reign of Emperor Commodus, however, the role of the emperor in the games becomes even more complex. Commodus, infamous for his obsession with gladiatorial combat, would participate in the games himself, fighting in the arena and even declaring himself a gladiator. His participation was a dramatic way of asserting his dominance, but it also drew criticism, as many saw it as a reflection of his vanity and madness. Historians still argue whether Commodus's participation in the games was a reflection of his need for control or simply a form of personal indulgence. In the end, gladiatorial games were not only a form of entertainment, they were deeply intertwined with Roman politics, imperial power, and the very idea of Roman identity. For the emperors, the games were a way to maintain power and project strength, while for the masses, they were a powerful symbol of the grandeur and might of the Roman Empire. The gladiators, in their blood-soaked performances, became part of a larger narrative about Roman dominance, a narrative that emperors were more than willing to embrace for their own political gain. As we explore the role of emperors in gladiatorial games, we can't ignore the social hierarchy that existed within the gladiatorial world. Gladiators were often viewed as the lowest of the low in Roman society, slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war who were forced to fight for the entertainment of others. But as their fame grew, so did their position in society. In some cases, gladiators were treated like celebrities, beloved by the masses and even able to rise above their initial status. However, this social mobility was fleeting, and the overall relationship between gladiators and Roman society was complex and often contradictory. Gladiators came from all walks of life. Many were slaves, taken captive from conquered territories, forced into the ludi, training schools, to fight in the arenas. These men had no choice in the matter. They were often considered the property of their owners, who would sell them to training schools where they would undergo brutal training in hopes of surviving the arena. In many cases, these gladiators were captured from the empire's farthest reaches, Gaul, Germania, Egypt, and beyond, and brought to Rome to fight in the famous arenas. But not all gladiators were slaves. In fact, some volunteered to fight. Known as auctorati, these men were often motivated by a desire for fame, wealth, or a sense of adventure. They were not forced to fight, but rather chose the path of the gladiator, often in hopes of winning public adulation and financial reward. The decision to become a gladiator was not a light one, as the risks were immense, but for those who managed to survive long enough and perform well, the rewards could be substantial. Successful gladiators could earn prize money, sponsorships, and even their freedom depending on their performances. But even the most successful gladiators were still at the mercy of their owners and the political whims of the emperor. While a victorious gladiator might be given a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom, this did not mean they would necessarily be free to live the life they wanted. Gladiators who were not slaves might have enjoyed a level of autonomy, but the majority of them lived under strict supervision. For these fighters, fame and wealth were fleeting commodities. Even the most famous gladiators could be thrown back into the arena after a few victories, depending on the needs of their owners or the emperor. The Roman perception of gladiators was often contradictory. On one hand, they were admired for their bravery, skill, and physical prowess. On the other hand, they were often seen as little more than entertainment, less than human, and certainly not equal to free Roman citizens. Gladiators were often depicted in Roman art and literature as fierce warriors, but they were also portrayed as expendable tools for the entertainment of the masses. Some Roman writers referred to gladiators as beasts, reducing them to mere commodities whose lives were forfeit at the whim of the arena. Despite this grim reality, the fame of gladiators could elevate them above their original station. Famous gladiators could enjoy the adoration of the crowd, earning the kind of fame that few others could attain. Roman society was deeply fascinated by these warriors. Gladiators who performed well in the arena often became celebrities, with their faces appearing on mosaics, statues, and even in the pages of Roman history. These fighters could become immensely wealthy through their victories, receiving gifts and sponsorships from admirers. Some gladiators even had fan clubs, with people from all walks of life coming together to cheer for their favorite fighters. The desire to see a gladiator in action was so intense that the most famous could fill the stands of the Colosseum with ease. But this fame came with a price. Gladiators were still at the mercy of their owners, and even the most famous could be forced back into the arena if their masters saw fit. They lived with the constant threat of injury or death, and even after a long career of victories, they could still find themselves in another fight for their life. The irony of their fame was that, for all their glory, they were ultimately bound by the brutal reality of the games. In Roman society, the gladiator status was also linked to the class system. Despite their fame, they were not considered part of the upper class. Gladiators were still considered slaves or subservient, regardless of their popularity. This division between the lower classes and the elite was one of the defining characteristics of Roman society. While gladiators could rise to prominence, they would never truly be accepted into the highest echelons of Roman society. Even the most skilled and famous gladiators were still seen as outsiders, separated from the privileges that came with being a freeborn Roman citizen. Yet, for all the limitations placed on gladiators, their role in society was not entirely without rewards. Some gladiators who survived long enough might be able to earn enough money to buy their freedom, or at least gain some measure of wealth and status. Others might use their fame to launch careers in other forms of public entertainment, such as acting or performing in theatrical shows. There were even cases of former gladiators becoming trainers in the ludi, passing on their knowledge to the next generation of fighters. Still, for most gladiators, the rewards were temporary, and their lives were ultimately marked by the same cycle of violence and spectacle that defined their existence in the arena. Despite their social position, gladiators also enjoyed a unique relationship with the Roman public. The games were, in many ways, an extension of Roman identity. The crowd's cheers for a brave gladiator were a reflection of the Roman admiration for strength, courage, and resilience. Gladiators were not just fighters, they were symbols of Roman power and dominance. They represented the strength of the Roman Empire, as well as the willingness to endure hardships for the sake of glory. In the end, the gladiators' relationship with Roman society was one of complex contradictions. While they were exploited as instruments of entertainment and death, they were also admired, even worshipped, by the people. Their lives were shaped by the games, but they were also defined by their ability to survive them. Gladiators were caught in a system that simultaneously dehumanized and glorified them, making them both heroes and victims. In the grand spectacle of the arena, they were both the stars and the slaves, their fates determined by the whims of emperors, the demands of the crowd, and the brutality of the games. Now that we've covered the social status of gladiators, let's delve into one of the most enduring myths surrounding gladiatorial combat: the notion that most gladiators met a violent death in the arena. It's a common assumption, popularized by movies and literature, but the reality is far more complex. While gladiators certainly faced the risk of death, the vast majority did not die in the arena. Instead, their fate was far more tied to their ability to entertain, perform, and survive. The concept of gladiatorial death has been heavily romanticized in modern culture. The image of a lone fighter, bloodied and beaten, succumbing to his wounds as the crowd roars, is deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness. However, the statistics tell a different story. While combat in the arena was brutal and dangerous, Historians estimate that only about 10% of gladiatorial matches resulted in the death of one of the fighters. This doesn't mean gladiators weren't at risk, far from it, but it does challenge the image of gladiators as mere pawns in a deadly game, where every match inevitably led to a fatal outcome. In reality, gladiatorial combat was far more nuanced. The life-or-death nature of these battles was not an automatic outcome, but rather something decided by the crowd, the emperor, and sometimes the gladiators themselves. It was not uncommon for gladiators to fight until one of them was injured or subdued but still alive. Many matches ended with one fighter surrendering rather than dying. This was especially true for those gladiators who had become popular with the crowd. A skilled gladiator who could keep the audience entertained had a better chance of surviving longer, since the crowd's reaction often influenced whether they lived or died. The crowd played a critical role in determining a gladiator's fate. When a gladiator was defeated, the crowd would decide whether the defeated fighter would live or die, often with a simple gesture. The iconic thumbs up or thumbs down gesture has long been associated with the decision, although historians still debate whether it was the thumb up or the thumb down that signified death. In either case, the crowd's reaction was essential. If the crowd called for mercy, the defeated gladiator would often be spared, even if the fight had been hard fought. If the crowd called for death, then the emperor or the editor of the games, whoever was in charge, would have the final say, deciding the fate of the defeated fighter. While the crowd's involvement in deciding life or death might sound merciless, it was not always as simple as a fight for survival. Gladiators who performed well were often granted a degree of respect. Popular gladiators were known to have been spared even after a loss, especially if they had captured the admiration of the crowd. These gladiators were valuable to their owners, who recognized their entertainment value and would be hesitant to risk losing a star performer. Gladiators who were victorious and who showed great skill or bravery could receive rewards like money, gifts, and even fame, often making them more valuable than their unremarkable counterparts. It was a system based on performance, charisma, and entertainment value. The crowd's fickle nature was a key component of the gladiatorial world, as their favor could determine the outcome of a fighter's career. Still, not all gladiators had the luxury of public favor. Many were slaves or prisoners who had little hope of being spared, no matter how well they fought. For these gladiators, death was a very real possibility. But even for these fighters, survival was not always an automatic death sentence. As strange as it may seem, gladiators were prized as valuable commodities. Owners often trained their gladiators for years, investing significant time and resources in them, hoping to reap the rewards of their victories. This made it in the best interest of owners to protect their fighters and ensure they survived as long as possible. In addition, the actual rules of combat were less about lethal violence and more about demonstrating skill and precision. The matches were often staged with rules, with both gladiators knowing that the primary objective was to entertain and demonstrate mastery of combat rather than to kill. The gladiators were highly trained professionals, and while the risk of injury was always present, the point of the game was not to kill, but to win in a way that showcased their abilities. They fought with the knowledge that in many cases, the goal was to impress the audience, outlast their opponent, and perhaps gain enough favor to secure a long and lucrative career. While death was certainly a risk, it was not an inevitable conclusion for most gladiators. Many who fought in the arena went on to fight again in future games. In fact, many gladiators survived for years, building careers based on their skill, charisma, and ability to entertain. Some even had long-term careers that saw them becoming legends in their own right, celebrated and feared by their fellow fighters and admired by the public. This shift in perspective, away from the idea of gladiators as doomed warriors to that of gladiators as skilled performers with agency, helps us understand the complex and multifaceted role these fighters played in Roman society. Gladiators were not just disposable entertainers, they were professional athletes, highly skilled in their craft, and often highly valued for their ability to entertain, survive, and perform. While their lives were certainly fraught with danger, it was not a simple death sentence every time they entered the arena. Rather, they were part of a system that balanced skill, luck, and public favor to determine their fate. Historians continue to debate the true mortality rates of gladiators, with some arguing that the concept of death in the arena has been exaggerated over the years. Whether or not they died in the arena, gladiators lived with the constant reality of risk, but they also lived with the possibility of survival, fame, and fortune. The reality of the gladiatorial world was far more complicated than the simplistic notion of death lurking around every corner. Instead, gladiators were part of a highly strategic, skill-based system where entertainment, survival, and success depended on far more than just the willingness to fight to the death. The gladiatorial arena wasn't just a battleground for warriors, it was a theater of grand spectacle. The design and architecture of the Roman amphitheaters, particularly the Colosseum, were meticulously planned to create the most exhilarating and dramatic experiences for the audience. The buildings themselves were as much a part of the spectacle as the gladiators. These arenas were designed with both functionality and entertainment in mind, showcasing the grandeur of Rome and its imperial power while ensuring that every fight, every event, could be as thrilling and visually stunning as possible. The Colosseum, the most famous of all the Roman amphitheaters, stands as an architectural marvel. It was built during the reign of Emperor Vespasian and completed by his son Titus in 80 AD. Its design was a brilliant feat of engineering, capable of holding over 50,000 spectators. The structure was purpose-built for the gladiatorial games and other public spectacles like mock sea battles, animal hunts, and even public executions. With its massive stone and concrete framework, the Colosseum's sheer size and grandeur were meant to convey the might of Rome. But it wasn't just about size, it was about creating an immersive experience that would capture the attention of the crowd, making them feel as though they were part of the action. The arena itself, the central pit where the gladiators fought, was designed to be a vast and open space, allowing spectators to watch every twist and turn of the combat. The shape of the Colosseum, an oval, allowed for optimal viewing from every angle so no one in the audience ever missed a moment. The stands were divided into sections based on social class, with the wealthier Romans seated closer to the arena floor, while the lower classes were placed higher up. This division reflected the strict class hierarchy of Roman society, with the emperor and the elite enjoying the best views of the spectacle below. One of the most innovative features of the Colosseum was its retractable awning, known as the velarium. The massive fabric canopy was stretched over the top of the arena to provide shade for the spectators during the intense Roman heat. It was an impressive engineering feat, requiring the coordination of hundreds of sailors to maneuver the fabric into place. The velarium not only provided comfort for the audience but also added to the grandeur of the event, as the cloth could be quickly unfurled or retracted, adding a dramatic flair to the opening of the games. Another aspect of arena design that contributed to the spectacle was the use of elaborate stage effects. The Colosseum, for example, had a sophisticated system of trapdoors, elevators, and hidden passageways that allowed for unexpected entrances and dramatic moments. These were used to introduce wild animals, like lions or elephants, into the arena or to create surprise attacks during staged battles. The animals were often a highlight of the events, and their sudden appearance would shock and excite the crowd. The use of these mechanical devices was essential in creating an atmosphere of suspense, ensuring that the audience was always on the edge of their seats. But the arena was not just designed for gladiators and animals. There were also times when naval battles or naumachii were staged. The Colosseum had a complex system of channels that could be flooded with water, allowing ships to battle on the arena floor. While these events were rare, they were among the most elaborate and spectacular spectacles staged for the public. The ships used in these mock battles were often replicas of real warships, and the men who participated had to be skilled in naval combat as well as gladiatorial fighting. These mock sea battles were part of the Roman emperor's efforts to demonstrate their military dominance, and they added a layer of drama and excitement to the games that few other events could match. The arena was not just a place for combat, it was a place for theater, where every fight was part of a larger story meant to entertain and awe the spectators. The games were highly organized and structured, with a program that included multiple events and combats, each building toward a dramatic conclusion. The flow of the event was designed to keep the audience engaged, alternating between battles, animal hunts, and executions to maintain a dynamic atmosphere. The organizers of these games knew how to pace the events to keep the excitement high and the crowd cheering for more. The gladiators in many ways were not just fighters, they were actors in a grand drama. They performed for the crowd, each match a carefully choreographed series of moves meant to capture the attention of the audience and entertain them with skill, bravery, and sometimes sheer spectacle. Gladiators were expected to adhere to certain roles. Some were meant to fight with honor, others with aggression, while some were tasked with performing acts of cunning or skill that would wow the crowd. A good gladiator didn't just fight. He put on a show, carefully timed to meet the expectations of the spectators. The public's approval or lack thereof could determine a gladiator's future. Those who could win over the crowd were often spared, while those who failed to impress were quickly forgotten. Historians still debate how much the gladiators themselves had control over the performance. Some argue that the matches were strictly controlled, with the gladiators following specific guidelines that would lead to certain outcomes. Others believe that there was more room for improvisation, with gladiators reacting to the crowd's reaction and adjusting their style based on the response they received. In either case, the gladiator's role as both a fighter and a performer was central to the success of the games. But while the games were designed to entertain, they were also a way for the emperors to display their power and maintain control over the Roman populace. The sheer scale of the events was a reflection of Roman wealth, power, and engineering prowess. The games were a way to solidify the emperor's image as the provider of peace and prosperity for the empire, using the arena as a tool for political propaganda. They were a way to distract the people from the harsh realities of daily life, offering them a temporary escape into a world of spectacle, where the fate of the gladiators, be they victorious or slain, was in the hands of the emperor. In the end, the gladiatorial games were much more than just fights. They were an elaborate performance, a demonstration of Roman power, and a tool for maintaining order and control in a vast and diverse empire. The arena was a stage where not just gladiators but the very essence of Roman identity was on display, and the crowds were eager participants in the drama that unfolded before them. It was a world where violence and entertainment coexisted, and where every fight, every spectacle, was a carefully orchestrated dance between life, death, and the thirst for spectacle. We've covered the grand spectacle of the gladiatorial arena, but the games were also deeply tied to Roman religion. In fact, the connection between gladiatorial combat and religious ritual is one of the more intriguing aspects of the events. While we often think of the arena as purely secular, gladiatorial contests initially had strong religious roots, and their connection to Roman beliefs was not just symbolic, it was central to their existence. The games were not merely entertainment, they were part of a larger system of religious and ritualistic practices that honored the gods and sought to gain divine favor. The origins of the gladiatorial games can be traced back to religious sacrifices. The first recorded gladiatorial combat took place in 264 BC, during a funeral for a nobleman named Junius Brutus. This initial fight, known as a munus, a public duty or service, was a tribute to the deceased and a way of honoring his spirit. In this case, the gladiators fought to appease the spirits of the dead and ensure that the soul of the nobleman could pass peacefully into the afterlife. It was a form of ritual combat, designed not only to entertain but also to serve a spiritual purpose. Over time, this connection to death and the afterlife became more formalized, and gladiatorial games came to be seen as a way of honoring the gods as well. The Roman Empire was polytheistic, and religion played an integral role in almost every aspect of daily life, including public spectacles. The gladiatorial games were often held in honor of particular gods, and these gods were invoked before and during the fights. For example, the god of war, Mars, was frequently associated with the games, as the combat resembled warfare and bloodshed. The Roman gods were seen as powerful figures whose favor was necessary for military success, and the games were viewed as a way to seek that favor. In this sense, the games were not just a public spectacle, they were a form of divine worship. The emperor, as the ruler and high priest of Rome, was seen as responsible for maintaining the peace of the empire through these acts of ritualized violence. Historians still argue about the extent to which religious observance influenced the gladiatorial games. Some scholars suggest that the games were primarily political tools used by emperors to maintain control over the masses, while others argue that the spiritual significance was much more profound. In any case, it is clear that the games had a religious dimension that went beyond mere entertainment. They were part of a larger system of rituals designed to ensure the favor of the gods, promote Roman virtues, and uphold the strength and stability of the empire. The religious aspects of the games weren't limited to the gladiators themselves. The spectators in the arena were also part of the ritual. Roman citizens believed that watching the games was an act of religious devotion, a way of participating in a sacred event that could bring them closer to the gods. By witnessing the spectacle and offering prayers or sacrifices to the gods, the audience was thought to gain divine favor. This was especially true for the elite, who would often sponsor games as a way to demonstrate their piety and commitment to the Roman gods. Emperors too used the games to reinforce their religious authority. By sponsoring grand spectacles, they not only showcased their political power but also reaffirmed their role as the protectors of Roman religion. The religious element of the gladiatorial games was also evident in the way the fights were structured. In some cases, the games included rituals where the gladiators themselves would offer sacrifices before the fight. These sacrifices could involve offerings to the gods, including burning incense, chanting prayers, or making symbolic gestures to honor the divine forces that were believed to govern their lives and deaths. The entire process was steeped in religious significance, and the gladiators were often seen as instruments of divine will, fighting not just for their survival but for the favor of the gods. Interestingly, the relationship between religion and the gladiatorial games was not without controversy. Some Roman writers and philosophers, such as Seneca and Pliny the Younger, expressed disapproval of the games, arguing that they were both morally wrong and a distraction from more noble forms of worship. They saw the violence and bloodshed of the arena as a perversion of true religious practice. Despite these criticisms, the gladiatorial games continued to thrive throughout the empire, as they remained deeply ingrained in the Roman public's understanding of both politics and religion. In fact, as the empire expanded, the games took on an even more prominent role in Roman life. During the reign of the emperors, gladiatorial contests were held not only in Rome but in cities throughout the empire, where they served as a way to connect local populations to the imperial center. These games were used to reinforce the idea of Roman unity and imperial power, while also serving as a way to integrate conquered peoples into the Roman world. The emperor, as both a political and religious figure, was the central figure in these games, and his participation in or sponsorship of the events was seen as a way to affirm his role as the divine protector of the empire. The decline of gladiatorial combat, which began in the later years of the empire, coincided with the rise of Christianity as the dominant religion of the Roman world. By the 4th century AD, the influence of Christianity led to growing criticism of the gladiatorial games, which were seen as a manifestation of pagan excess and cruelty. Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity and became the first Christian emperor, issued edicts that eventually led to the abolition of the games. Christian leaders condemned the games as barbaric and immoral, and by the end of the 5th century, gladiatorial combat had largely disappeared from the Roman world. The legacy of the gladiatorial games, however, remains. While they may have been abolished, the game's influence continues to echo through history, influencing modern entertainment, sports, and our understanding of ancient Roman culture. The notion of the gladiator, with his bravery, skill, and potential for both fame and death, has captivated our imaginations for centuries. Today, the image of the gladiator, whether in literature, film, or art, remains a symbol of endurance, strength, and the tension between life and death. In the grand sweep of history, the gladiatorial games were far more than just a form of entertainment. They were a complex blend of politics, religion, and spectacle, serving as both a tool of social control and a means of demonstrating Roman power. The gladiators, who risked everything for the chance at glory, became symbols of the empire's strength, while the games themselves were woven into the very fabric of Roman life. Even as the games faded into history, their legacy continues to captivate and intrigue us, offering a window into the blood-soaked world of ancient Rome. As the gladiatorial games gradually faded into history by the 5th century, the decline was not just a result of changing religious beliefs, but also a shift in cultural attitudes and societal structures. The world that had once eagerly embraced these brutal spectacles was transforming, and the gladiators who had once been the stars of the Roman Empire slowly slipped into obscurity. But their influence didn't vanish entirely. As Rome declined, the legacy of the gladiators continued to leave its mark on modern culture, shaping how we view competition, entertainment, and even our relationship with violence. The end of the gladiatorial games coincided with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which occurred in 476 AD. The rise of Christianity, combined with the social and political upheaval that marked the empire's collapse, made the continuation of these games increasingly untenable. Christian leaders, many of whom had ascended to positions of power within the empire, vehemently opposed the games, seeing them as not only cruel but also contrary to Christian values of compassion and mercy. Gladiatorial combat, which had once been associated with pagan rituals, was gradually condemned as barbaric. The formal abolition of gladiatorial combat came in 404 AD, when Emperor Honorius issued an edict banning the games after the martyrdom of a Christian monk named Telemachus. Telemachus, having witnessed the bloodshed of a gladiatorial fight in the arena, intervened in an attempt to stop the violence. His death at the hands of the crowd further fueled the anti-gladiatorial sentiment within Roman society, and it marked a significant turning point in the empire's shift toward Christianity. Though gladiatorial combat did not vanish overnight, by the early 5th century, the games were no longer a central part of Roman life, marking the end of an era that had lasted for centuries. However, even as the gladiatorial games came to a close, the gladiators' cultural impact didn't fade entirely. The legacy of these fighters, who had once been revered as both warriors and performers, continued to reverberate throughout history, influencing art, literature, and later forms of entertainment. The concept of the gladiator, strong, skilled, and willing to fight to the death, has endured as a symbol of strength, survival, and honor. In medieval Europe, gladiatorial combat was largely forgotten, but elements of the gladiatorial tradition resurfaced in the form of jousting tournaments and other forms of chivalric combat. These contests, though less bloody and far more ceremonial than their Roman predecessors, retained the same competitive spirit that had defined the gladiatorial games. While knights weren't exactly gladiators, the martial valor and sense of spectacle in these tournaments were very much in line with the Roman traditions of combat for the sake of honor, spectacle, and public admiration. As time went on, the gladiator's image was resurrected in Renaissance art, which often depicted them as symbols of classical virtue, courage, and the human struggle against death. The gladiators' stories were celebrated in poems, paintings, and sculptures, where they were immortalized as noble warriors who had faced unimaginable odds. This classical ideal of the gladiator would continue to influence Western culture for centuries, but it wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that the gladiator truly became a figure of modern pop culture. The resurgence of interest in the gladiators in the modern era is most vividly seen in films, books, and television shows. Movies like Gladiator, 2000, starring Russell Crowe, brought the story of the gladiator into contemporary consciousness, blending historical elements with modern sensibilities. In these films, gladiators were often portrayed as tragic heroes, fighting against an unjust system, seeking freedom or redemption. The visual power of the gladiator in modern media is undeniable. Sword-wielding warriors facing death with courage and defiance still resonate with audiences around the world. The gladiator's image in pop culture also embodies themes of resistance, strength, and personal triumph against overwhelming odds. In modern mixed martial arts, MMA, and professional wrestling, we can see the echoes of the gladiatorial tradition. Fighters are not only physically skilled but must also be able to entertain, perform, and cultivate a persona, much like their ancient counterparts. The connection between gladiatorial combat and modern sports is evident in the way these athletes are idolized and revered by their fans. They are celebrated for their physical abilities, their bravery, and their willingness to enter the arena. Even in the realm of video games, the gladiator has remained a potent symbol. In games like Gladiator, Sword of Vengeance, and Rise, Son of Rome, players take on the role of a gladiator fighting in the arena, facing enemies in brutal combat. These games, like the films, capture the essence of the gladiatorial spirit: bravery in the face of death, the desire for fame, and the thrill of victory against overwhelming odds. However, the gladiator's legacy isn't limited to pop culture. The very nature of the gladiatorial games continues to influence modern-day discussions about violence, spectacle, and entertainment. The debate about the ethics of watching violence for entertainment purposes, whether in the form of gladiatorial combat, professional wrestling, or even modern violent sports like MMA, continues to mirror the complex relationship that ancient Romans had with their gladiators. For the Romans, the arena was both a place of brutal spectacle and an arena for showcasing power, wealth, and divine favor. Today, the ongoing consumption of violent sports and entertainment continues to raise questions about the role of violence in society, the need for competition, and the ethical implications of watching others fight for entertainment. What we see, then, is that the gladiators' legacy is much more than a relic of ancient Rome. Their influence transcends time and culture, informing everything from our entertainment choices to our understanding of heroism, sacrifice, and the human condition. While the physical gladiatorial games may have ended long ago, the spirit of the gladiator, facing death with courage and determination, remains alive in modern culture, continuing to inspire, entertain, and provoke thought. While gladiatorial combat may have disappeared from the public stage by the end of the Roman Empire, its influence lived on through the centuries, not only through the resurgence of interest in Roman history during the Renaissance but also in the enduring appeal of gladiatorial themes in literature and modern media. The idea of combat for survival, the fight against overwhelming odds, and the spectacle of violence all shaped the evolution of modern competitive sports, entertainment, and the broader concept of heroism in Western culture. One of the most fascinating aspects of the gladiators' legacy is how it relates to modern-day competitions. We often see parallels between ancient gladiators and the athletes who now take center stage in combat sports such as boxing, mixed martial arts, MMA, and wrestling. These modern gladiators, while participating in a very different kind of arena, still embody many of the same principles that governed ancient gladiatorial combat: strength, skill, and an unyielding drive to survive against formidable opponents. Much like their ancient counterparts, modern combat sports athletes are trained for brutal physical contests, where injury and pain are commonplace, and the risks they take are immense. The fans, too, are not dissimilar to the crowds of ancient Rome, eager to cheer for their favorite fighter, immersed in the drama of the battle, and willing to pay top dollar for the privilege of watching someone risk it all for glory. The ludi of ancient Rome may have faded, but the ludi of today's combat sports arenas, where athletes engage in physical contests that involve endurance, skill, and often the threat of injury, bear striking similarities. Even the political aspect of the gladiatorial games has a modern parallel. The idea that an emperor could sponsor these events to secure loyalty or sway public opinion is echoed in the way modern political figures use sports and entertainment to rally support. Just as gladiatorial games were used to keep the population distracted from political and social unrest, today's politicians often use major sporting events, celebrity culture, or even media appearances as ways to influence public sentiment and distract from more serious matters. Whether it's a football championship or a reality TV show, entertainment is still used as a tool for soft power in modern society. Moreover, the themes of struggle and victory, death and redemption that were central to the gladiatorial games have permeated much of contemporary storytelling. We see these themes play out in countless forms of entertainment, from epic action movies like Gladiator, 2000, to historical dramas to modern-day sports films and even video games. These media portray combat not just as physical struggle but as an existential battle between life and death, good and evil, or freedom and oppression. The imagery of the gladiator, a fighter who rises from the ashes of despair and overcomes insurmountable odds to achieve victory, has become a potent symbol of individual triumph. It speaks to the human desire for redemption, for proving one's worth in a world that often feels unfair and unforgiving. The visual legacy of the gladiator has also found a permanent place in popular culture. The gladiatorial image, whether it's the helmeted fighter, the shield and sword, or the arena itself, is immediately recognizable. Gladiators are often depicted as heroic figures who face great danger and potential death with courage and dignity. They may fight for freedom, vengeance, or simply survival, but their battle is always about more than the fight itself. It's about proving their humanity, their strength, and their ability to endure even in the face of overwhelming odds. This portrayal of the gladiator is symbolic of broader themes in modern society: the struggle for recognition, the desire to overcome obstacles, and the pursuit of personal and collective freedom. But beyond their role in combat, gladiators are also symbols of resilience. They were often seen as the underdogs, men who were often forced into the arena as slaves or criminals, but who could rise above their circumstances through skill, bravery, and the will to survive. This narrative resonates strongly with modern audiences, especially in the context of marginalized or disenfranchised groups who fight for a voice in a world that often ignores them. The gladiator's story is not just about physical strength but about the human spirit, its capacity to endure, to survive, and ultimately to triumph. In addition to the gladiatorial archetype, another legacy that survives today is the concept of the games themselves. The very idea of organized competition as entertainment has been integral to human society for centuries. From ancient chariot races to modern-day sports leagues, the thrill of competition has always been tied to the spectator experience. Today, we enjoy various forms of competition that hark back to the gladiatorial tradition, from televised sports to reality shows like Survivor or The Challenge. where contestants face physical and mental challenges in a race for survival or reward. It's fascinating to think about how gladiatorial combat set the foundation for these types of entertainment. The modern fascination with competition, physical prowess, and the human struggle for victory can trace its roots back to the arenas of ancient Rome. The crowds that once cheered for gladiators now cheer for athletes, actors, and reality TV stars, yet the underlying excitement remains the same: a yearning for drama, spectacle, and the triumph of the human spirit. As we reflect on the legacy of gladiators, we can't ignore the broader implications of their impact on Roman society. The gladiatorial games were not only about violence and spectacle, they were also a reflection of Roman values, social structures, and religious practices. Gladiators, despite their status as slaves or criminals, embodied the virtues of courage, skill, and endurance that the Romans prized. The games were a way for the Roman state to communicate with its people, to remind them of the empire's strength, and to reinforce the hierarchical social order that kept the empire functioning. Ultimately, the gladiator's story is one of both tragedy and triumph. It's a story of men who were often forced into the arena but who, through their skill and resilience, became symbols of the Roman Empire's might and power. Though their deaths were often brutal and meaningless, their legacy has endured as a testament to the human capacity to rise above adversity and to find meaning and purpose in the most unlikely of places. In the end, we are left with a lasting image of the gladiator, not as a mere footnote in history, but as a symbol of what it means to fight for one's survival, to embrace the struggle, and to find glory in the face of death. The gladiator's legacy continues to shape our understanding of entertainment, competition, and the human spirit, ensuring that their story is told and retold for generations to come. As we look back on the gladiators' influence throughout history, it's clear that their legacy isn't just about ancient Roman games or the violent spectacles of the arena. In many ways, the gladiator serves as a symbol of human endurance and the ultimate pursuit of freedom. But the gladiator's role in society also transcended combat and entertainment. Over time, they came to embody much deeper themes, those of sacrifice, fate, and the human drive to overcome personal struggles. While many of the games were designed to showcase the might of the Roman Empire and entertain the masses, they were also an avenue for the gladiators themselves to find a form of redemption. In a world where social mobility was almost non-existent, a gladiator's victory in the arena might be one of the only ways to break free from the oppressive system that enslaved them. Whether they were slaves, criminals, or volunteers, the chance to fight for freedom was a powerful motivator for many gladiators. The eventual rudis, the symbolic wooden sword that signified freedom, was the ultimate prize, though not every gladiator would see that dream realized. The myth of the gladiator's redemption is compelling because it touches on the idea that even in the face of extreme adversity, there is a path to liberation. Modern audiences are drawn to this narrative because it speaks to the universal struggle for self-determination, the desire to escape oppression, and the hope that through perseverance and strength, one can change their fate. The gladiator's story, fighting not just for survival but for freedom, has resonated through history, influencing countless films, books, and stories where the hero triumphs over overwhelming odds. But what makes this redemption so powerful is that it wasn't always guaranteed. Gladiators, while given the opportunity to fight for their lives, were at the mercy of those who controlled the games: the emperors, the organizers, and the audience. Their fate was often in the hands of others, which reflects a deep, existential tension that the gladiator's story conveys. The gladiator, as a symbol of resilience, is also a symbol of the limitations of human agency. No matter how much effort or skill they exerted, they could still fall victim to the whims of the crowd or the ruling powers. This complex interplay between agency and fate is one of the key themes that makes the gladiator's story so timeless. Today, we see this paradox reflected in the rise of modern competition, particularly in professional sports and entertainment. In sports like boxing, MMA, and even football, athletes often face the same dichotomy. They fight for glory, wealth, and respect, but at the same time, their success is dictated by an external system of rules, promoters, and public opinion. While these athletes are admired for their strength and ability to persevere, their futures remain uncertain, and they too are vulnerable to injury, burnout, or a sudden fall from grace. The gladiatorial spirit lives on in the way we view modern athletes as both heroes and victims, adored by fans but subject to the unforgiving nature of competition and fame. Beyond the physical and emotional toll of their careers, Gladiators also played a significant role in shaping the social and cultural fabric of ancient Rome. As symbols of Roman power, they represented not just the empire's military might but its values, strength, courage, and resilience in the face of adversity. The gladiatorial games were a way for the Romans to reinforce their collective identity, and the gladiators themselves were often seen as reflections of the empire's ideals. Their victories were celebrated as victories for Rome itself, reinforcing the idea that the empire, like the gladiator, could overcome any challenge. However, the gladiator's role as a symbol of power and pride for Rome was also paradoxical. While gladiators were lauded for their bravery and skill, they were also seen as expendable tools for entertainment. The gladiatorial games were an arena where death and glory existed side by side, and where the line between heroism and tragedy was often blurred. In this sense, the gladiator also symbolizes the darker side of Roman imperialism, the exploitation of the individual for the benefit of the state and the spectacle. The gladiator's body was a site of both valor and vulnerability, a place where the empire could showcase its power and subjugate its people simultaneously. The tension between the glorification of the gladiator as a hero and the brutal reality of his life as a slave or prisoner of war is at the heart of why the gladiatorial games remain such a compelling and enduring topic. It is this dichotomy, the contrast between freedom and bondage, life and death, heroism and exploitation, that continues to captivate modern imaginations. In many ways, the gladiator's legacy serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked power and the fragile nature of human life. In addition to their roles in combat and their symbolic representation of Rome's power, gladiators also became figures of myth and legend. Stories of famous gladiators such as Spartacus, who led a revolt against the Roman Empire in 73 to 71 BC, have become part of the cultural fabric of Western civilization. Spartacus's story in particular has been romanticized and retold in countless books, films, and television shows, becoming a symbol of rebellion and resistance. Spartacus's desire for freedom and his fight against an oppressive system made him a hero in the eyes of many, even though he ultimately lost the battle against Rome. His legacy, much like that of the gladiators who came before him, speaks to the enduring appeal of the struggle for freedom, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Through stories like Spartacus's, the gladiators of ancient Rome have transcended their historical role as mere entertainers. They have become emblems of resistance, symbols of defiance against tyranny, and icons of the human spirit's ability to fight for a better life. This mythologization of the gladiator has made them timeless figures, continuing to inspire countless generations who see in them the possibility of overcoming adversity, even in the most brutal of circumstances. In the modern world, the gladiator's legacy continues to influence how we view competition, struggle, and victory. Whether it's the athletes we cheer on in the sports arena or the protagonists we follow in our favorite action films, the gladiator archetype remains a powerful symbol of the struggle for survival, the pursuit of glory, and the relentless drive to overcome obstacles. The spirit of the gladiator, with all its complexity and contradiction, remains alive in the modern world, reminding us of the eternal battle between human will and the forces that seek to control us. As we draw our exploration of the gladiators and their enduring legacy to a close, it's important to reflect on how the gladiators' lives and stories have influenced not just entertainment and sports, but also the cultural and philosophical values that shape modern society. The gladiators, in their complex roles as both victims and heroes, have taught us much about the nature of power, sacrifice, and human resilience. Their story transcends the Roman Empire, resonating deeply in our contemporary world and challenging us to reflect on our own values, our notions of success, and our relationship with entertainment. At the heart of the gladiatorial games was the idea of spectacle, of watching individuals risk their lives for the pleasure of the crowd. The audience in ancient Rome came for more than just the violence. They came for the drama, the emotion, and the sense of human triumph in the face of death. The gladiators were both fighters and performers, fulfilling the expectations of their masters and their spectators, who were as much invested in the performance as in the outcome of the fight itself. This relationship between gladiator and audience echoes in the way modern societies engage with media and entertainment. Today we have athletes, actors, and performers who, like the gladiators of Rome, exist in a complex relationship with the public. They are celebrated for their strength, talent, and bravery, but also exploited for the pleasure of the crowd and the profits of the industry. The gladiator's existence as a commodity, both a tool for entertainment and a symbol of Roman imperial power, has direct parallels with the modern celebrity culture. Today's athletes and entertainers often find themselves in a similar position, worshipped and admired for their abilities but also subject to the demands and scrutiny of the public eye. Gladiators, like modern-day superstars, could be built up by their owners and audiences, only to be discarded when they no longer fit the needs of the spectacle. This cycle of glory and fallibility is an enduring element of the human condition, and the story of the gladiators serves as a reminder of how individuals can be both elevated and dehumanized by the demands of fame and spectacle. Perhaps one of the most poignant lessons we can take from the gladiators is the complex nature of sacrifice. The gladiators gave their lives, quite literally, in the arena, and their sacrifice was both a means of survival and a part of the broader Roman system of power and control. But their sacrifices were not always in vain. Some gladiators were able to escape the arena, win their freedom, or achieve such fame that their names were remembered long after their deaths. Gladiators became symbols of personal sacrifice, but also of human agency, the ability to shape one's destiny, even when the odds were stacked against them. In a way, they represent the tension between fate and free will. They were subject to forces beyond their control, yet their performances in the arena could turn them into legends. This struggle between fate and self-determination is something that continues to be explored in literature, film, and philosophy. In the ancient world, the gladiator was both a pawn and a hero. His fate, often determined by forces outside of his control, whether the whim of the emperor or the will of the crowd, reflects the struggle for autonomy and the human desire to control one's destiny. Modern heroes, whether in films or real life, often echo this same struggle. They must navigate the tension between personal choice and external forces, whether it's society, family, or the expectations of the public. The gladiator's story, therefore, speaks to a universal human experience, the desire to overcome the challenges placed before us, to assert our humanity, and to strive for something greater than ourselves. As we reflect on the gladiatorial games, it's essential to recognize that while they were violent, their ultimate legacy lies not in the bloodshed but in the ways in which they shaped Roman society and, by extension, modern culture. The gladiators embodied many of the values that the Romans held dear: strength, honor, loyalty, and bravery. Yet, in their very struggle for survival, they also highlighted the darker aspects of Roman life: slavery, exploitation, and the dehumanizing effects of spectacle. The gladiators lived in the tension between heroism and victimhood, a duality that continues to shape how we view those who fight for our entertainment today. The gladiators' influence extends beyond just entertainment. It can also be seen in the legal and political systems that followed the Roman Empire. The gladiators, often enslaved or forced into service, were part of a larger system of control, where the emperor and the elite held power over the lives of the masses. While the games themselves eventually faded away, the fundamental structures of power and class inequality that defined the Roman Empire still resonate in our world today. The gladiator's story is, in many ways, a reflection of the systems of oppression and exploitation that continue to exist in various forms throughout the world. Their legacy forces us to examine how power operates and how it shapes the lives of those who are subject to it. Ultimately, the gladiator's story is one of transformation. These individuals, who began as captives or criminals, became symbols of resistance and human strength. They fought not only for survival but for glory, for freedom, and for the chance to reshape their destinies. The gladiatorial games, while brutal and violent, were also a stage for the triumph of the human spirit. The gladiators' resilience, courage, and ability to endure pain and hardship are qualities that continue to inspire us. Their legacy teaches us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, there is room for individual agency, for personal growth, and for the hope of redemption. As we look to the future, the gladiator story will undoubtedly continue to influence the way we tell stories, the way we view competition, and the way we understand human endurance. The gladiator is not just an ancient symbol. They are a timeless figure whose struggles and triumphs continue to resonate across centuries. Their story is one that speaks to the universal human experience, our capacity to fight, to survive, and to rise above adversity. And in that, the gladiators will always be remembered, not just as warriors of ancient Rome, but as eternal symbols of the human spirit. Thank you for taking this journey through history with me. I hope the stories of the gladiators have left you with something to ponder. Now, as the day fades and the night settles in, may you find peace and rest. Sweet dreams.